Well, here we are, Sunny Jims, and Medieval has finally been finished. The game that does to Heretic and Hexen what DUSK did for Blood, Quake, and Redneck Rampage. If you've been buying into the whole throwback shooter thing lately, well, no doubt a Medieval has been on your radar. And if you haven't, well, it bloody well should be. Published by New Blood Interactive, the guys who worked on DUSK and the recent Maximum Action, Medieval has been developed by Indefatigable, those guys. And it's a dark fantasy first-person shooter, putting you in the boots of an unnamed champion, battling evil across 7 different worlds. Like I said before, it's a bit of a throwback to games like Heretic and Hexen. I've even heard some people comparing this to Witchhaven, but comparing a Medieval to Witchhaven is like comparing Pink Floyd to Avril Lavigne. With suitably challenging difficulty modes and a soundtrack by Andrew Hulshult, who honestly at this point can do no wrong, it's definitely going to be one of the better shooters to come out in 2019. So let's take a look at it, shall we? And see if the whole thing was worth the wait. I'm even making this video suffering from jet lag and crappy allergies, because I like you. I like you a lot. What a Medieval offers is more than just a campaign, it's a pilgrimage across 7 different worlds, exploring detailed and gorgeous looking environments brought to life by the Unreal 4 engine, against enemies that pose an actual threat and aren't too shy in trying to murder the piss out of you. Now it's broken down, as I said, into 7 different worlds or episodes, with the 7th one being unlocked once you finish the prior 6. Now it's a first person shooter, but the weapons you're using are a bit different to what most people might expect. Instead of using shotguns and assault rifles, you're using magic swords and staffs. And instead of ammunition, you're using mana. To make it even simpler, mana's broken down between blue, green, purple, and orange, kinda like Hexen with its blue and green mana. And they've done a pretty good job of making these weapons feel kind of unique and fun to use, but also keeping them in line with the archetypes you expect to see in these kind of games. So you start off with an axe, which is pretty basic. Just kinda swing this thing at whatever you want dead, and usually it gets the job done. Sounds like you're swinging a telegraph pole at someone when you use this thing, and when it's powered up, it turns into a goddamn boat propeller. The first real weapon you get though is the Staff of the Azure Orb, which fires out these little homing projectiles at a decent fire rate for half decent damage. I mean, not an amazing weapon, but handy to fall back on. It's decent against trash mobs, but against the bigger and tougher enemies it gets outclassed pretty quickly. Next you've got the Whisper's Edge, which is a magic sword that fires out this long projectile, which you could kind of compare to the spread from a shotgun. Also due to the fact that it takes up the 3rd weapon slot, which is always reserved for shotguns in like 99% of old shooters. This thing is hands down one of the better weapons in the game, and it seems to have an almost infinite range, making it surprisingly useful at taking out enemies from a long distance. Plus, it just looks super cool. I mean, I think it's based off a saber, but I'm probably wrong, and I'm sure there's going to be that one guy who'll be able to correct me in the comments section. You know who you are. The next weapon is the Triad. Now this is a trident looking thing that shares blue mana with the staff. What makes this thing cool though is its overkill mechanic. When you kill someone you got the option to keep firing on them, at which point they will literally explode for an overkill, which chains lightning to nearby enemies, often killing them in a single hit. There doesn't seem to be a limit to this, so you can sometimes wipe out an entire cluster of bad guys in a single overkill. It's awesome. Plus, I just never get sick of that satisfying crunch when something explodes. Next, you've got your rocket launcher, which is probably one of the coolest weapons in the entire game. And this thing is called the Celestial Claw. What this bad boy does is pull random planets out of the cosmos and launch them at enemies. Yeah, this thing is pulling planets out of the universe, shrinking them down and then launching them at enemies. I mean, that's some of the most metal shit I've ever seen in a video game. And if you happen to be living on any of those planets getting launched, well, sucks to be you. You can also use this thing to rocket jump, or should I say planet jump. Rounding out the rest of the weapons, you've got the Star of Torment, which is the closest thing we get to a shotgun in the entire game. Now this thing fires out a bunch of crystal shards which do a whole heap of damage and can even pin enemies to walls, a bit like the Penetrator in Fear. Also, the Penetrator is the nickname your mum gives me. Schwacked. The only catch is that you gotta be really close when using it so all the shards hit an enemy, but I mean otherwise it's easily one of the most effective weapons in the whole game. Finally, you've got a Medieval's version of the BFG called the Aeternum, which looks like a bunch of ribbons that are just floating in the air. And like the BFG, it shoots out this large ball of energy that explodes and obliterates pretty much everything nearby. They also give you a whole heap of mana for this thing, to the point where I actually maxed it out without even realizing. But it sure does help with house cleaning when you got a bunch of assholes on top of you at any one time. And on top of all of that shit, each weapon is then modified by the soul power mechanic. Right, so every time you kill something in a medieval, they drop a soul, and the size of the soul depends on the size of the enemy. Once you max out your soul power meter, you then press alternate fire to activate soul power mode, which just makes all of your weapons super strong, kind of like the Tome of Power in Heretic. And even something as simple as the staff can just tear everything and you corn shoot. For the Whisper's Edge, it means the projectiles do way more damage and can pass through enemies. For the Volt Triad, you're basically shooting out Sith lightning, and the overkill ability is way more powerful. I mean, look at it. The Star of Torment now shoots faster and fires homing shards, which can be used really effectively to cheese out some of the bosses. And then the Aeternum fires out a goddamn black hole. What I think I love most about these weapons though is that none of them ever feel redundant, aside from maybe the axe. When you're playing Doom for instance and you get the chain gun, you'll probably never use the pistol ever again. And again, you're more likely to use the super shotgun over the basic shotgun in Doom 2, right? I never found that to be the case in a medieval, even though I'd have both the Staff and the Volt Triad, or the Whisper's Edge and the Star of Torment, all of which share the same mana pools. I'd still use either weapon over the other in certain situations. The Staff still has its purpose and benefits over the Volt Triad, just like the Whisper's Edge does over the Star of Torment, at times. Probably helps that all the weapons look and sound great. I mean, the sound design in general is just fantastic. Lots of meaty and punchy weapon effects when you're cutting guys to pieces, and those cathartic sound effects when you're picking up health and mana items. And the music? My god, the music. If you've played DUSK, well, you're going to be familiar with Andrew Hulshult's work, and again, the guy has just smashed another home run. Funny thing is though, one of my favourite tracks in the game is one that's not even all that intense or heavy. I can't even pronounce the name of it properly, but it's one of the more mellow tracks during one of the later chapters, and it's a lot more ambient and atmospheric. And it's even more impressive because the music changes from level to level and episode to episode. And that's really one of the best things about a medieval, is just how different each episode feels. So you got 7 episodes all up, right? With 3 main levels and a 4th for a boss fight. And each one will probably take anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes to finish. The first one is the Astral Equinox, and this one is pretty basic as a means of just easing the player into the mechanics. You're not going to fight anything too outlandish or find yourself having to navigate environments that are all that complex or confusing. I mean, it is still challenging and rightfully so, but not crushingly difficult. You're exploring areas like temples, cliffsides and hidden vaults, fighting cultists, acolytes and giant dudes in suits of armor. New weapons are introduced each level, and the whole episode ends with a boss fight against the Moon Guardian, who can be beaten pretty easily as long as you don't stand still. The second episode is the Domain of the Sentinels. Now this one's some real HP Lovecraft shit. This time you're moving through all of these alien looking citadels and fortresses, fighting parasitic creatures with giant eyeballs, that look like a cross between something you'd see in Quake 1 or read about in Call of Cthulhu. Cthulhu. Did I pronounce that right? Are you happy? Some of the enemies in this episode too, when they die, there's a chance their heads are going to pop out of their bodies and chase after you, which is amazing. The boss fight for this episode is a giant ball sack that jumps around the room to make it harder to hit, but can be put down pretty easily with soul power. Now, every first-person shooter has its bad chapter, bad level, or episode. For Doom, I think it was the entirety of Thy Flesh Consumed. In Blood, it's A Farewell to Arms. And with Half-Life, it was On a Rail. Well, Medieval has its own crappy episode, and that's episode 3, The Sacred Path. It encapsulates a couple of shitty things about old-school first-person shooters, and that's annoying and spongy enemy types and repetitive level design. Funny thing is, this whole episode got patched, rebalancing some of the enemy types because originally it was even worse. But even with all of these improvements, I just think this whole episode just kinda sucks. I think visually it's really cool though, and it's one of the few episodes where you see any actual blue skies, so thematically it's unique. But the levels feel like a slog to get through, and the boss fight ain't all that great either. This is rectified with episode 4, The Solar Solstice, say that 5 times fast, which I think is easily one of the best episodes in the whole game. This one is more of a medieval theme like the Astral Equinox, where you're up against evil looking solar knights who worship the sun, which is in contrast to the first episode where those bad guys worship the moon. One of the enemy types in this episode has a shield and can deflect projectiles back at the player, a little bit like the centaurs in Hexen. This whole episode just felt really fun to play, and the enemy count is really high too, but the environments allow for plenty of mobility to keep your distance. And then you can go all out with a weapon like the Celestial Claw. Enemies in this episode hit really hard, but they blatantly telegraph their attacks, and you've got no real excuse for taking a hit, so it feels a lot more skill-based during combat. And again, the boss fight for this one, super cool. Sadly though, the Forges, which is the next episode, I think is also a bit weak. The first level takes place during some kind of moody rainstorm where you can barely see your surroundings, and you're dealing with enemies who can fire lasers at you, regardless of the distance they are away. The second level of this one involves some tedious platforming across narrow ledges. This episode also has one of the most annoying enemy types in the entire game, which are these giant sea urchin looking things that just collide with you to do damage, with the added benefit of exploding on death. I mean, there's nothing cool or creative about an enemy that just has to come into contact with you to do damage. It's lame. It's not that it's hard, it's just time consuming, and it forces you to really slow down and play it super conservatively. It's disappointing too because visually this episode is really unique and kinda gorgeous at times. Some of the areas you'll come across are really appealing and stand out amongst the rest, like check this one out for instance. Overall, I'd say it's better than episode 3, but not by much. But I mean, hey, 5 out of 7 ain't bad. Thankfully though, episodes 6 and 7 after them are fantastic. Well, episode 6 is. Episode 7 is okay, but I won't spoil it. In fact, I've purposefully tried not to use any footage of it in this video. Episode 6 I think features some of the most appealing looking areas in the entire game. The Arcane Expanse, what an awesome name, is a world inhabited by mages and wizards with the environments featuring floating islands and structures, winding paths that cross over bottomless chasms and shards of crystal magically conjoined into spiders and snakes. Yes, some of the enemies in this episode are crystal spiders and snakes that shatter into about 1 million pieces when you kill them. It's rad. The whole vibe of this episode is just like none of the others, showing off some fantastic level design. One point you'll use these large floating pools of water as a means of platforming for instance. Just the usage of colour in this episode is amazing, but just combine that with some of the environments where there's frequent use of reflective surfaces, and it makes for one of the more visually memorable episodes in the entire game. I think it even might be my favourite. In fact, you know what? Yeah, fuck it, it's my favourite. Then once you've finished this one, you're able to head on to the final episode, complete 3 more levels before you take on the final boss and schwack him. But I won't spoil that because you're best off experiencing it for yourself. When you see people talking about this game on the Steam forums, you don't see too many people saying that it's bad, and the reason for that is that there's really not all that much stuff to complain about. I guess one thing is that if you're getting a little bit over these throwback shooters, well, then this one isn't really going to win you over or give you a sudden change of heart. But in its defense, Medieval, along with DUSK and Iron Maiden, are some of the earliest games to kick off that whole throwback shooter genre, so it's not really fair to give it crap in that regard. There are some issues with certain enemy types where their hitboxes are huge, and you almost can't get past them at times, creating some crappy situations where you get blocked in, even though it feels like you should be able to move. You hear my voice going? I'm losing my fucking voice. Combined with what I said earlier about some of the stuff in episode 3 and 5, which is just complete bollocks. Putting you on a narrow walkway and having enemies rush you from head on so you can't even sidestep to avoid incoming damage is not fun level design, it's just lame. This kind of thing doesn't happen too much, but when it does, it's just obnoxious. And it stands out because most of the time the level layout is really fair to the player. It doesn't rely on cheap tactics to make it more challenging. I mean, look, it does have a few rocky episodes and the odd crappy level here and there, but that's to be expected. Not everything's gonna be amazing. Even Knee Deep in the Dead had command control. Unreal Engine 4 is often a pretty hot topic of contention, and I know I've had problems in the past with certain titles because of optimization and stuff like that, but I haven't really had that problem here. The whole thing ran at a pretty solid frame rate almost the entire time, and it probably helps that there's a whole crap load of visual options to mess around with too. From the brightness and the saturation through to the field of view, anti-aliasing, shadows, and whatever else you might want to modify, it's all there. Overall, there's very little reasons for me to not recommend Medieval. The campaign's got a pretty decent length to it, then you still need to go back in for achievement hunting and all that nonsense. Then of course there's also the endless mode where you get to fight a never-ending onslaught of enemies. The story mode though is where it's at, and these guys I think have done a great job of paying homage to titles like Heretic, Hexen, and yeah okay, Witchhaven, while still putting a fresh twist on things and making it stand apart as its own product. There's few games out there where you can use an axe like a boat propeller or launch entire planets at someone. And you know what? That honestly makes it worth checking out alone.